we crudely organized this in terms of 3 bins, because I believe every pudding should have some structure to it, which gets you closer to cake. The first item on the first bin for organizing this pudding is optimizing metabolism. The second bin is repairing damage, and the third component is non-biological solutions or non-biological technologies that will contribute solutions. So we are going to start with the first bin item, which is optimizing metabolism. And by the way, all of this is supposed to take place in the context of doing something about aging in a less than 20-year time frame, specifically keeping alive those people we really care about, people like Saul Kent, of course. And that's our goal. So vision of 50 years from now is not our goal. So in terms of optimizing metabolism, some of the headings that we have are obviously a caloric restriction, fasting, things like that, where we have very good model system data that it does in some sense optimize metabolism for extending longevity. The discussion of supplements, hormone, and there'd be hormone supplementation. It's a separate theme. And one issue that's near and dear to my heart is the extent to which any of those forms of metabolic optimization can be genomically informed. So let's take the first one. Who would like to speak to the question of caloric restriction and fasting as a means to optimize metabolism in our group here? Very good. Peter.
I'd actually like to ask a clarification here on the procedure, because I don't think we need to spend any time talking about the merits of calorie restriction. And if anybody's interested, they could look at my website, and that's not what we're here for. I think what we're here for, if I understand correctly, is to identify fundable projects that will move us forward. So under calorie restriction, I guess there would be, if anybody here has a proposal, or if we know of a proposal that isn't represented here, that would move it forward. And I assume calorie restriction, there's not a lot more to be learned. We already know it helps tremendously to practice it, but I assume we'd be
I have a project.
What we can learn from that. So let's talk about.
I'll give you an example of what I think is a problem in caloric restriction and our use of it. And my question would be, is caloric restriction anything other than a shifting of resources away from reproduction toward the soma? Is that the entire story of caloric restriction? Or is it in fact a true...
Is there something that's fundable to answer that question? Is there something that you want funded to answer that question?
I'll give you...
If it was, how would that help us, help the people in this room live longer?
Well, I would suggest that for a lot of people who want to optimize their health, their fertility might be part of their health. So I think a key question that, for example, if I was considering caloric restriction, I would want to know whether or not in adopting it I'm impairing my fertility and other reproductive functions for the benefit of my survival or not. And that is a question which is not yet fully resolved.
Well, are you proposing that we have a discussion about the merits of caloric restriction?
Oh, no. So at this point, what we're doing, I think Peter's imperative is a good one. Can we delineate a specific research project within this bin that, if done quickly, would in fact, that's aging, you have the aging longevity dichotomy, that's in play. So it's whether or not there's something that can be done soon.
I understand.
And what would it be?
My question is, again, are you proposing to discuss the merits of caloric restriction or make a proposal for research about caloric restriction, or whether it has
well, I mean, caloric restriction is an interesting topic because, we all know how to do it. So how to do it isn't a huge issue. So the question could be defined, therefore, as, I gave a proposal. The proposal can be dropped. All we're trying to do in this very small amount of time we have for these discussions is have ideas bounce from person to person and not just presented. So I threw out an idea. If the idea is of no merit or interest, we can move on to the next topic.
Let me just make a comment, and
yes.
I'll let others can speak. But if we come to the conclusion that caloric restriction experiments in animals have merit and that they may have merit for humans, I don't think we need to do more caloric restriction experiments in animals. I don't think we need to discuss whether humans should practice caloric restriction, because very few people, Peter is one of them, but very few people will do that. But a project worth discussing is, can we find something that can mimic the effects of caloric restriction that doesn't require a caloric restriction?
Right. So I was about to say that myself. Now, of course, there is already a lot of money in the search for pharmacological mimics of calorie restriction. And I think one thing that we probably ought to be bearing in mind, even though this session is about science brainstorming rather than about money, is that it's laying the foundations for tomorrow, and therefore we want to have in the back of our minds the question of prioritizing ideas with respect to whether new money would make a big difference. So in respect of calorie restriction and the possibility of mimetics for it, I think the first thing that occurs to me is the big unknown in calorie restriction, which is how much difference, if any, is it actually going to make for humans. And of course, we know that there are various extremely long primate studies going on, which are gradually moving towards some sort of resolution. There are also, of course, much smaller studies on human calorie restriction, including the one that Peter's involved in. But one thing that I would like to see that I don't think there would be much enthusiasm for from the NIH or whatever, because it's just probably too expensive and too speculative, is to look for populations that have genetic mimetics of calorie restriction. There's only one example of this that I know of in the literature. A group, a group of people in the little island of Krk off the Adriatic coast of Croatia, which have the same mutation that is found in one of the spontaneous long-lived mice that are, to a large extent, mimetics of calorie restriction. But there are now close to a dozen different genetic changes that have been made in mice that do things to the metabolism that's rather similar to what happened in calorie restriction and have the same effect, life-extending effects. So it's high time we had a serious search for human equivalents of those mutations and did some serious epidemiology on them. And I think that's the sort of project that could bring results in a relatively small number of years. It's definitely not being done. It would definitely give information that we need.
Great idea.